Today, I'm going to talk about the deepest spiritual experience I've ever had, which was the first time I took acid, and which forever destroyed my scientific dogmas about God. I'm going to share my insights into what God really is from a non biblical, non dogmatic, mystical, embodied, directly apprehended perspective. This is a Deep Psychology podcast. I'm Ross. We blend spirituality, psychology, and self help to help you shine a light on your inner workings. The insights I share have helped me deeply understand myself and transform my life. Listen to this podcast if you want to get real, powerful insights and avoid all the fluffy nonsense that abounds in self help circles. You'll know more about your psychology than 99% of people out there. You can find me on all the major podcasting platforms or head to deep-psychology.com, visited by thousands every month for tons of free resources. And a disclaimer before we start. The information here is strictly educational. I'm not responsible or liable for any damage you cause yourself while using psychedelics. These substances can potentially be very dangerous and even lethal. If you use them, please do so carefully and responsibly. So, as a long-term meditator, I've had a lot of sudden spiritual experiences both on and off the cushion, and I feel like I have a fairly stable spiritual connection and insight. But by far the deepest experience I've ever had was on acid. And it left me in zero doubt that God is real, and also that most people have no idea what it really is. Just want to be clear that I'm not talking about the biblical God, the great man in the sky. I'm not talking about Christian dogma here. This has nothing to do with belief. I was not born Christian. I was not born Jewish. I was not born Buddhist or anything. My family is not Christian or religious. And for my whole life, I was basically a scientific dogmatist, a Stephen Hawking fanboy. I mean, listen, I think Stephen Hawking is a miracle, but I thought science was everything, and that if we wanted to know the truth of the universe and of life, we should just listen to science. And let me tell you that this trip completely destroyed that, and it's never come back. So the first acid trip I did was in my house alone with no stimulation, and I think this was one of the main reasons I had such a deep experience. I felt completely at ease and ready to let go. I didn't come in necessarily wanting a spiritual experience. I just kind of came in with the attitude of, let me see what I need to see. Let the acid show me what I need to be shown at this moment in time. And I was a bit anxious. It was my first acid trip, but I'd done a lot of experience and I'd closely followed people's advice on the internet, experienced trippers. And it took about 45 minutes for it to come on. Now, the things I describe here might not make sense to you if you've never experienced them. In fact, it's difficult for them to make sense if you've never experienced them for yourself, and you might think I'm crazy here. But listen, I'm going to try my best to explain them, and I'm being 100% deadly serious here. Everything I'm saying is what I experienced. What happened in this trip was that once I was quite under the influence, which was maybe about an hour and a half or 2 hours in, my usual sense of self and all of its associations and opinions and models and theories and memories and philosophies, it slowly started getting torn away from me, which I'd already experienced on shrooms quite powerfully. So I was quite prepared for it. And I remember that this trip, for at least an hour or two, I was just lying on the floor while a lot of blockage was getting released from the body. I remember wriggling around, having body highs, doing a lot of stretching and yoga. Not that I was in really a state to do proper yoga. I was more just lying on the ground and feeling like all this blockage and tension getting released from the body. And that lasted at least an hour or two. And then came like the really profound part, which I would say it was maybe just after the peak, just after when it was most intense, the acid, which was maybe 4 or 5 hours into the trip. I didn't take that much. It was just my first trip, maybe about half a tab, I think. And all of a sudden, again, I can't really remember at what point in the trip or what was sort of the lead up. I just remember all of a sudden being very clear about what God was, um, being shown very clearly, just unmistakably clearly, what God really is. And I want to be clear here that this was not a hallucination. I wasn't seeing anything. I was just in my room, um, in my house, seeing everything as normal, except seeing it from this very profound new perspective. I wasn't seeing any visuals here. When I say shown and being sort of metaphorical, it was very embodied. It was a direct apprehension of God. It's way beyond visuals. It penetrated right to the heart of my identity, my sense of self, and my entire life really just put into an entirely new context. All of my friends, all of my family, my likes, my dislikes, all of my beliefs, all of it was put into this big, enormous, beautiful context. And I really, when I say see or show, please don't think visuals, because it is way more profound than that. And again, the direct apprehension of these realities is quite difficult to articulate. So I'm going to try my best. But trust me when I say that I was so in contact with God and how my life relates to God that I've basically never been the same again. And I don't think I will be. I do feel in contact with it or him or her, God, very often, but not to the level that I was during the trip. So I'd also want to say that I could use any other placeholder when I'm talking about these experiences. God is just a placeholder. It's just a word for something. I could use any other one. You know, all the spiritual traditions have these placeholders. It's just at that time, that particular trip, I don't know why the word God just seemed very relevant. It just seemed like it was the adequate description. Maybe I needed to understand that all of our ideas about God are false, and I needed to see the real truth of the word. But the word itself is not that important, and don't fixate on it. We could use many other words here, but I'm going to stick with God. So, what did I realize about God? And this is what I realized at the time. These are all subject to revision. I'm not going to pretend to have fully understood everything here. These are subject to revision, but this is what seemed extraordinarily clear to me at the time. So let me share. I realized that God is who I really am, who I've always been, deep down in my heart, in my most essential nature since I was born. Yet I've completely forgotten that that's who I really am. And I spend my life pretending that I'm someone else, that I'm Ross, basically, that I'm this character in this video game. I've just forgotten. And in that sense, my life, I could see that my personal history and my friends and my family and everything that I'd done, everything I'd achieved, everything I'd experienced, all the tears, all the pain, all the joy, the ups and the downs, all of that was just kind of like a story, just this little story that had veiled this true nature and who I really was this whole time. And I want to say as well, when I realized this was like the first, I was in this state for maybe half an hour. That was sort of the first thing, was realizing that's who I really am. And realizing this was the happiest I've been in my entire life. The joy is just unimaginable. Just the entire body, the all my blockages and all my pain and all my all my struggles just gone, just gone, just left with this absolute pure joy, just for my life and for who I am and for being alive and for being God. What actually is God, and I think this came on next, is God is just absolute undividedness. Absolute undividedness. And how does this relate to being human? Well, as humans, you might not realize this if you've not maybe done meditation or something of that kind. But literally, in our first person experience, we feel very separated and contracted um, from the world, from others around us. Like it literally feels right now, for example, that when you're listening to this and when you're watching the screen and so on, it feels you're on one side of your face and the world is on the other side. Um, this is really an optical illusion. All of that sense of separation is just a mirage. Um, it's a mirage in the sea of God. And when I realized that God was this absolute undividedness, it's so undivided that it can actually be divided, apparently be divided infinitely, yet still remain completely undivided. You literally die into the sea of God when you realize this undividedness. And leading on from that, I realized that we all, every single one of us, every single human being has perfect knowledge of God. How could it be any other way? We're already in the sea of God. We're already that's where we are. We all already have perfect knowledge of it, and our apparent ignorance of God is just apparent. It's that ignorance is just a veil. It's also just a mirage. It's not it's it's kind of an optical illusion, an illusion. All of this ignorance, even our scientific denial of God, is really just God tricking himself. It's this absolute undividedness dividing itself up and forgetting what it really is. I remember looking at people's photos of people that I knew, like my family, my friends, and I just kept saying to myself out loud, like, so just this, like, just complete disbelief, complete euphoria. Wow, they know God. Wow, they know God. And I remember even thinking, wow, even my dad knows God. The person that apparently doesn't care for these topics and doesn't think about the meaning of things at all. Even my dad knows God just as fully as I can see him right now. See him, see it, see her, see God right now. I also realize that because we're already in the sea of God, in this absolute undividedness, that really is nowhere to go. There's really nothing to do. You can't even die. You can't die. It doesn't even make any sense to be dead. It makes sense from the divided humans or limited divided human perspective. But from God's perspective, from the perspective of God, from the perspective of this absolute undividedness that includes absolutely everything, there is nothing to do but be in God, because that's the ultimate nature of absolutely everything. And you can never not be there. I also realized that life is a game. think of it as a spiritual game. Obviously, this isn't everything there is to life, but in this sense, in the sense of awakening to God, that life is a spiritual game in which you're put against the clock to find God. And there's all sorts of um, mirrors, smoke and mirrors, distractions, obstacles, and red herrings put in your path to find Him. And it's only a game against yourself. If you don't find God in your lifetime, there's no judgment here. There's no judgment at all. And in fact, you've already found Him. It's just you versus you. If you don't want to know God, if you want to continue denying, if you want to not put in the work perhaps necessary to find God, all you're doing is really postponing the inevitable and going through a lot of pain by doing so. And that pain is what will eventually drive you to find God, because really pain is not seeing this absolute infinite undividedness that God really is. That's what pain ultimately comes down to, because you're not, or we're not, one is not just fully consciousness of that absolute undividedness that is what you really are. I'm guessing that this apprehension of these truths, that this experience lasted about 30 minutes, and eventually the acid wore off, and I was basically in the afterglow period. I was still sort of having body highs. I had this sort of lingering sense of joy and fulfillment, and that depth of insight left me, but I knew that it would never truly leave me. Like, it was so, oh, wow, it was so powerful that it can never leave you. And looking back now, 8 years later, 7 years later, 7 years later, it hasn't left me. And I see it now as just a brief glimpse of what I will eventually experience. We will all come to eventually experience. Perhaps later in life, perhaps when we die. I don't know when this happens, but that sheer direct apprehension of our deepest, undivided, limitless, infinite nature, once we've lived in a state for a while in the state of separation and contraction and ignorance, I don't say that as a judgmental thing, it's just kind of a fact. Once we've experienced that, we will eventually come back to this absolute undividedness, this God nature. Now, I just want to make a point here, because I'm a meditator and I'm a meditation teacher. I'm not saying that psychedelics can replace a dedicated spiritual practice. I think they just give you a very brief, deep insight that you possibly, unless, barring doing lots and lots of spiritual practice and barring some sort of spontaneous, unexpected, deep experience, I'm not sure you can get such a deep insight with such quickness. And I'm not saying quickness is the goal. I just think seeing this deeper truth of who you are, what life really is, what it's all really about. Even if you're not going to be there all the time afterwards, it will never leave you, and it can be extremely humbling, and it can guide your spiritual path in ways that I think are very tricky to have unless you have, say, a very highly enlightened teacher, very competent one, or you have some other way. I don't know. For me, I could not imagine my spiritual life without having that experience. So I'll be talking much more about about psychedelics in future, but for now, let's wrap up. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to share your experiences on acid, or any spiritual insights you've had on acid. And stay tuned because I've got lots more coming your way in the coming weeks and months. So take care, and I'll see you soon.